Chapter 37 of Arthur Mervyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Arthur Mervyn by Charles Brockden Brown. Chapter 37. Mervyn's auditors allowed no pause in their attention to this story. Having ended, a deep silence took place. The clock which stood on the mantel had sounded twice the customary alarm, but had not been heard by us. It was now struck a third time. It was 1. Our guest appeared somewhat startled at this signal, and looked, with a mournful sort of earnestness, at the clock. There was an air of inquietude about him which I had never observed in an equal degree before. I was not without much curiosity respecting other incidents than those which had just been related by him, but after so much fatigue as he had undergone, I thought it improper to prolong the conversation. "Come," said I, "my friend, let us to bed. This is a drowsy time, and, after so much exercise of mind and body, you cannot but need some repose. Much has happened in your absence, which is proper to be known to you, but our discourse will be best deferred till to-morrow. I will come into your chamber by day-dawn, and unfold to you particulars." "Nay," said he, "withdraw not on my account. If I go to my chamber, it will not be to sleep, but to meditate, especially after your assurance that something of moment has occurred in my absence. My thoughts, independently of any cause of sorrow or fear, have received an impulse which solitude and darkness will not stop. It is impossible to know too much for our safety and integrity, or to know it too soon. What has happened?" I did not hesitate to comply with his request, for it was not difficult to conceive that, however tired the limbs might be, the adventures of this day would not easily be expelled from the memory at night. I told him the substance of the conversation with Mrs. Althorpe. He smiled at those parts of the narrative which related to himself, but when his father's depravity and poverty were mentioned, he melted into tears. "Poor wretch! I, that knew thee in thy better days, might have easily divined this consequence. I foresaw thy poverty and degradation in the same hour that I left thy roof. My soul drooped at the prospect, but I said, it cannot be prevented, and this reflection was an antidote to grief. But now that thy ruin is complete, it seems as if some of it were imputable to me, who forsook thee when the succour and counsel of a son were most needed. Thou art ignorant and vicious, but thou art my father still. I see that the sufferings of a better man than thou art would less afflict me than thine. Perhaps it is still in my power to restore thy liberty and good name, and yet that is a fond wish. Thou art past the age when the ignorance and grovelling habits of a human being are susceptible of a cure." There he stopped, and, after a gloomy pause, continued. "I am not surprised or afflicted at the misconceptions of my neighbours with relation to my own character. Men must judge from what they see; they must build their conclusions on their knowledge. I never saw in the rebukes of my neighbours anything but laudable abhorrence of vice. They were too eager to blame, to collect materials of censure rather than of praise. It was not me whom they hated and despised; it was the phantom that passed under my name, which existed only in their imagination, and which was worthy of all their scorn and all their enmity. What I appeared to be in their eyes was as much the object of my own disapprobation as of theirs. Their reproaches only evinced the rectitude of their decisions, as well as of my own. I drew from them new motives to complacency. They fortified my perseverance in the path which I had chosen as best. They raised me higher in my own esteem. They heightened the claims of the reproachers themselves to my respect and my gratitude. They thought me slothful, incurious, destitute of knowledge and all thirst of knowledge, insolent and profligate. They say that in the treatment of my father I have been ungrateful and inhuman. I have stolen his property and deserted him in his calamity. Therefore they hate and revile me. It is well. I love them for these proofs of their discernment and integrity. Their indignation at wrong is the truest test of their virtue. It is true that they mistake me, but that arises from the circumstances of our mutual situation. They examined what was exposed to their view, they grasped at what was placed within their reach. To decide contrary to appearances, to judge from what they knew not, would prove them to be brutish and not rational, would make their decision of no worth, and render them in their turn objects of neglect and contempt. It is true that I hated school, that I sought occasions of absence, and finally, on being struck by the master, determined to enter his presence no more. I loved to leap, to run, to swim, to climb trees, and to clamber up rocks, to shroud myself in thickets and stroll among woods, to obey the impulse of the moment, and to prate or be silent, just as my humour prompted me. All this I loved more than to go to and fro in the same path, and at stated hours to look off and on a book, to read just as much and of such a kind, to stand up and to be seated, just as another thought proper to direct. I hated to be classed, cribbed, rebuked, and feruled at the pleasure of one who, as it seemed to me, knew no guide in his rewards but caprice, and no prompter in his punishments but passion. It is true that I took up the spade and the hoe as rarely, and for as short a time as possible. I preferred to ramble in the forest and loiter on the hill, perpetually to change the scene, to scrutinize the endless variety of objects, to compare one leaf and pebble with another, to pursue those trains of thought which their resemblances and differences suggested, to inquire what it was that gave them this place, structure, and form, were more agreeable employments than ploughing and threshing. My father could well afford to hire labour. What my age and my constitution enabled me to do could be done by a sturdy boy, in half the time, with half the toil, and with none of the reluctance. The boy was a bond servant, and the cost of his clothing and food was next to nothing. True it is that my service would have saved him even this expense, but my motives for declining the effort were not hastily weighed or superficially examined. These were my motives. My frame was delicate and feeble. Exposure to wet blasts and vertical suns was sure to make me sick. My father was insensible to this consequence, and no degree of diligence would please him but that which would destroy my health. My health was dearer to my mother than to me. She was more anxious to exempt me from possible injuries than the reason justified, but anxious she was, and I could not save her from anxiety but by almost wholly abstaining from labour. I thought her peace of mind was of some value, and that, if the inclination of either of my parents must be gratified at the expense of the other, the preference was due to the woman who bore me, who nursed me in disease, who watched over my safety with incessant tenderness, whose life and whose peace were involved in mine. I should have deemed myself brutish and obdurately wicked, to have loaded her with fears and cares merely to smooth the brow of a forward old man, whose avarice called on me to sacrifice my ease and my health, and who shifted to other shoulders the province of sustaining me when sick, and of mourning for me when dead. I likewise believed that it became me to reflect upon the influence of my decision on my own happiness, and to weigh the profits flowing to my father from my labour against the benefits of mental exercise, the pleasures of the woods and streams, healthful sensations, and the luxury of musing. The pecuniary profit was petty and contemptible. It obviated no necessity. It purchased no rational enjoyment. It merely provoked, by furnishing the means of indulgence, an appetite from which my father was not exempt. It cherished the seeds of depravity in him, and lessened the little stock of happiness belonging to my mother. I did not detain you long, my friends, in portraying my parents and recounting domestic incidents when I first told you my story. What had no connection with the history of Welbeck and with the part that I have acted upon this stage, I thought it proper to omit. My omission was likewise prompted by other reasons. My mind is enervated and feeble, like my body. I cannot look upon the sufferings of those I love without exquisite pain. I cannot steel my heart by the force of reason and by submission to necessity, and therefore too frequently employ the cowardly expedient of endeavouring to forget what I cannot remember without agony. I told you that my father was sober and industrious by habit, but habit is not uniform. There were intervals when his plodding and tame spirit gave place to the malice and fury of a demon. Liquors were not sought by him, but he could not withstand entreaty, and a potion that produced no effect upon others changed him into a maniac. I told you that I had a sister whom the arts of a villain destroyed. Alas! the work of her destruction was left unfinished by him. The blows and contumelies of a misjudging and implacable parent, who scrupled not to thrust her, with her new-born infant, out of doors, the curses and taunts of unnatural brothers, left her no alternative but death. But I must not think of this. I must not think of the wrongs which my mother endured in the person of her only and darling daughter. My brothers were the copyists of the father, whom they resembled in temper and person. My mother doted on her own image in her daughter and in me. This daughter was ravished from her by self-violence, and her other children by disease. I only remained to appropriate her affections and fulfil her hopes. This alone had furnished a sufficient reason why I should be careful of my health and my life, but my father's character supplied me with a motive infinitely more cogent. It is almost incredible, but nevertheless true, that the only being whose presence and remonstrances had any influence on my father, at moments when his reason was extinct, was myself. As to my personal strength, it was nothing, yet my mother's person was rescued from brutal violence. He was checked, in the midst of his ferocious career, by a single look or exclamation from me. The fear of my rebukes had even some influence in enabling him to resist temptation. If I entered the tavern at the moment when he was lifting the glass to his lips, I never weighed the injunctions of decorum, but, snatching the vessel from his hand, I threw it on the ground. I was not deterred by the presence of others, and their censures on my want of filial respect and duty were listened to with unconcern. I chose not to justify myself by expatiating on domestic miseries, and by calling down that pity on my mother which I knew would only have increased her distress. The world regarded my deportment as insolent and perverse to a degree of insanity. To deny my father an indulgence which they thought harmless, and which indeed was harmless in its influence on other men, to interfere thus publicly with his social enjoyments, and expose him to mortification and shame, was loudly condemned. But my duty to my mother debarred me from eluding this censure on the only terms on which it could have been eluded. Now it has ceased to be necessary to conceal what passed in domestic retirements, and I should willingly confess the truth before any audience. At first, my father imagined that threats and blows would intimidate his monitor. In this he was mistaken, and the detection of this mistake impressed him with an involuntary reverence for me, which set bounds to those excesses which disdained any other control. Hence I derived new motives for cherishing a life which was useful in so many ways to my mother. My condition is now changed. I am no longer on that field to which the law, as well as reason, must acknowledge that I had some right, while there was any in my father. I must hazard my life, if need be, in the pursuit of the means of honest subsistence. I never spared myself in the service of Mr. Hadwin, and, at a more inclement season, should probably have incurred some hazard by my diligence. These were the motives of my idleness, for my abstaining from the common toils of the farm passed by in that name among my neighbours, though, in truth, my time was far from being wholly unoccupied by manual employments, but these required less exertion of body or mind, or were more connected with intellectual efforts. They were pursued in the seclusion of my chamber, or the recesses of a wood. I did not labour to conceal them, but neither was I anxious to attract notice. It was sufficient that the censure of my neighbours was unmerited to make me regard it with indifference. I sought not the society of persons my own age, not from sullen or unsociable habits, but merely because those around me were totally unlike myself. Their tastes and occupations were incompatible with mine. In my few books, in my pen, in the vegetable and animal existences around me, I found companions who adapted their visits and intercourse to my convenience and caprice, and with whom I was never tired of communing. I was not unaware of the opinion which my neighbours had formed of my being improperly connected with Betty Lawrence. I am not sorry that I fell into company with that girl. Her intercourse has instructed me in what some would think impossible to be attained by one who had never haunted the impure recesses of licentiousness in a city. The knowledge which a residence in this town for 10 years gave her audacious and inquisitive spirit she imparted to me. Her character, profligate and artful, libidinous and impudent, and made up of the impressions which a city life had produced on her coarse but active mind, was open to my study, and I studied it. I scarcely know how to repel the charge of illicit conduct, and to depict the exact species of intercourse subsisting between us. I always treated her with freedom, and sometimes with gaiety. I had no motives to reserve. I was so formed that a creature like her had no power over my senses. That species of temptation adapted to entice me from the true path was widely different from the artifices of Betty. There was no point at which it was possible for her to get possession of my fancy. I watched her while she practised all her tricks and blandishments, as I regarded a similar deportment in the animal Salax ignavumque, who inhabits the sty. I made efforts to pursue my observations unembarrassed, but my efforts were made, not to restrain desire, but to suppress disgust. The difficulty lay, not in withholding my caresses, but in forbearing to repulse her with rage. Decorum, indeed, was not outraged, and all limits were not overstepped at once. Dubious advances were employed, but, when found unavailing, were displaced by more shameless and direct proceedings. She was too little versed in human nature to see that her last expedient was always worse than the preceding, and that, in proportion as she lost sight of decency, she multiplied the obstacles to her success. Betty had many enticements in person and air. She was ruddy, smooth, and plump. To these she added, I must not say what, for it is strange to what lengths a woman destitute of modesty will sometimes go, but, all her artifices availing her not at all in the contest with my insensibilities, she resorted to extremes which it would serve no good purpose to describe in this audience. They produced not the consequences she wished, but they produced another which was by no means displeasing to her. An incident one night occurred, from which a sagacious observer deduced the existence of an intrigue. It was useless to attempt to rectify his mistake by explaining appearances in a manner consistent with my innocence. This mode of explication implied a continence in me which he denied to be possible. The standard of possibilities, especially in vice and virtue, is fashioned by most men after their own character. A temptation which this judge of human nature knew that he was unable to resist, he sagely concluded to be irresistible by any other man, and quickly established the belief among my neighbours that the woman who married the father had been prostituted to the son. Though I never admitted to the truth of this aspersion, I believed it useless to deny, because no one would credit my denial, and because I had no power to disprove it. End of chapter 37. Of Arthur Mervyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Arthur Mervyn by Charles Brockden Brown. Chapter 38. What other inquiries were to be resolved by our young friend, we were now, at this late hour, obliged to postpone till the morrow. I shall pass over the reflections which a story like this would naturally suggest, and hasten to our next interview. After breakfast next morning, the subject of last night's conversation was renewed. I told him that something had occurred in his absence in relation to Mrs. Wentworth and her nephew that had perplexed us not a little. "My information is obtained," continued I, "from Wortley, and it is nothing less than that young Clavering, Mrs. Wentworth's nephew, is at this time actually alive." Surprise, but none of the embarrassment of guilt, appeared in his countenance at these tidings. He looked at me as if desirous that I should proceed. "It seems," added I, "that a letter was lately received by this lady from the father of Clavering, who is now in Europe. The letter reports that this son was lately met with in Charleston, and relates the means which old Mr. Clavering had used to prevail upon his son to return home, means of the success of which he entertained well-grounded hopes. What think you?" "I can only reject it," said he, after some pause, "as untrue. The father's correspondent may have been deceived. The father may have been deceived, or the father may conceive it necessary to deceive the aunt, or some other supposition as to the source of the error may be true, but an error it surely is. Clavering is not alive. I know the chamber where he died, and the withered pine under which he lies buried." "If she be deceived," said I, "it will be impossible to rectify her error." "I hope not. An honest front and a straight story will be sufficient." "How do you mean to act?" "Visit her without doubt, and tell her the truth. My tale will be too circumstantial and consistent to permit her to disbelieve." "She will not hearken to you. She is too strongly prepossessed against you to admit you even to a hearing." "She cannot help it. Unless she lock her door against me, or stuff her ears with wool, she must hear me. Her prepossessions are reasonable, but are easily removed by telling the truth. Why does she suspect me of artifice? Because I seemed to be allied to Welbeck, and because I disguised the truth. That she thinks ill of me is not her fault, but my misfortune, and, happily for me, a misfortune easily removed." "Then you will try to see her?" "I will see her, and the sooner the better. I will see her to-day, this morning, as soon as I have seen Welbeck, whom I shall immediately visit in his prison." "There are other embarrassments and dangers of which you are not aware. Welbeck is pursued by many persons whom he has defrauded of large sums. By these persons you are deemed an accomplice in his guilt, and a warrant is already in the hands of officers for arresting you wherever you are found." "In what way," said Mervyn, sedately, "do they imagine me a partaker of his crime?" "I know not. You lived with him. You fled with him. You aided and connived at his escape." "Are these crimes?" I believe not, but they subject you to suspicion. To arrest and to punishment? To detention for a while, perhaps, but these alone cannot expose you to punishment. I thought so. Then I have nothing to fear. You have imprisonment and obloquy, at least, to dread. True, but they cannot be avoided but by my exile and skulking out of sights, evils infinitely more formidable. I shall, therefore, not avoid them. The sooner my conduct is subjected to scrutiny, the better. Will you go with me to Welbeck? I will go with you. Inquiring for Welbeck of the keeper of the prison, we were informed that he was in his own apartment, very sick. The physician attending the prison had been called, but the prisoner had preserved an obstinate and scornful silence, and had neither explained his condition nor consented to accept any aid. We now went alone into his apartment. His sensibility seemed fast ebbing, yet an emotion of joy was visible in his eyes at the appearance of Mervyn. He seemed likewise to recognize in me his late visitant, and made no objection to my entrance. "How are you this morning?" said Arthur, seating himself on the bedside and taking his hand. The sick man was scarcely able to articulate his reply. "I shall soon be well. I have longed to see you. I want to leave with you a few words." He now cast his languid eyes on me. "You are his friend," he continued. "You know all. You may stay." There now succeeded a long pause, during which he closed his eyes, and resigned himself as if to an oblivion of all thought. His pulse under my hand was scarcely perceptible. From this in some minutes he recovered, and, fixing his eyes on Mervyn, resumed in a broken and feeble accent. "Clemenza, you have seen her. Weeks ago I left her in an accursed house, yet she has not been mistreated. Neglected and abandoned, indeed, but not mistreated. Save her, Mervyn. Comfort her. Awaken charity for her sake. I cannot tell you what has happened. The tale would be too long, too mournful, yet in justice to the living I must tell you something. My woes and my crimes will be buried with me. Some of them, but not all. Ere this I should have been many leagues upon the ocean, had not a newspaper fallen into my hands while on the eve of embarkation. By that I learned that a treasure was buried with the remains of the ill-fated Watson. I was destitute. I was unjust enough to wish to make this treasure my own. Prone to think I was forgotten or numbered with the victims of pestilence, I ventured to return under a careless disguise. I penetrated to the vaults of that deserted dwelling by night. I dug up the bones of my friend, and found the girdle and its valuable contents, according to the accurate description that I had read. I hastened back with my prize to Baltimore, but my evil destiny overtook me at last. I was recognized by emissaries of Jameson, arrested and brought hither, and here I shall consummate my fate, and defeat the rage of my creditors by death. But first—" Here Welbeck stretched out his left hand to Mervyn, and after some reluctance showed a roll of lead. "Receive this," said he. "In the use of it be guided by your honesty and by the same advertisement that furnished me the clue by which to recover it. That being secured, the world and I will part forever. Withdraw, for your presence can help me nothing." We were unwilling to comply with his injunction, and continued some longer time in his chamber, but our kind intent availed nothing. He quickly relapsed into insensibility, from which he recovered not again, but next day expired. Such, in the flower of his age, was the fate of Thomas Welbeck. Whatever interest I might feel in accompanying the progress of my young friend, a sudden and unforeseen emergency compelled me again to leave the city. A kinsman, to whom I was bound by many obligations, was suffering a lingering disease, and, imagining, with some reason, his dissolution to be not far distant, he besought my company and my assistance, to soothe at least the agonies of his last hour. I was anxious to clear up the mysteries which Arthur's conduct had produced, and to shield him, if possible, from the evils which I feared awaited him. It was impossible, however, to decline the invitation of my kinsman, as his residence was not a day's journey from the city. I was obliged to content myself with occasional information, imparted by Mervyn's letters or those of my wife. Meanwhile, on leaving the prison, I hasted to inform Mervyn of the true nature of the scene which had just passed. By this extraordinary occurrence, the property of the Maurices was now in honest hands. Welbeck, stimulated by selfish motives, had done that which any other person would have found encompassed with formidable dangers and difficulties. How this attempt was suggested or executed he had not informed us, nor was it desirable to know. It was sufficient that the means of restoring their own to a destitute and meritorious family were now in our possession. Having returned home, I unfolded to Mervyn all the particulars respecting Williams and the Maurices which I had lately learned from Wortley. He listened with deep attention, and, my story being finished, he said, "In this small compass, then, is the patrimony and subsistence of a numerous family. To restore it to them is the obvious proceeding. But how? Where do they abide?" "Williams and Watson's wife live in Baltimore, and the Maurices live near that town. The advertisements alluded to by Wortley, and which are to be found in any newspaper, will inform us. But first, are we sure that any or all of these bills are contained in this covering?" The lead was now unrolled, and the bills which Williams had described were found enclosed. Nothing appeared to be deficient. Of this, however, we were scarcely qualified to judge. Those that were the property of Williams might not be entire, and what would be the consequence of presenting them to him if any had been embezzled by Welbeck? This difficulty was obviated by Mervyn, who observed that the advertisement describing these bills would afford us ample information on this head. Having found out where the Maurices and Mrs. Watson live, nothing remains but to visit them, and put an end, as far as lies in my power, to their inquietudes. "What? Would you go to Baltimore?" "Certainly. Can any other expedient be proper? How shall I otherwise ensure the safe conveyance of these papers?" "You may send them by post." "But why not go myself?" "I can hardly tell, unless your appearance on such an errand may be suspected likely to involve you in embarrassments." "What embarrassments? If they receive their own, ought they not to be satisfied?" "The inquiry will naturally be made as to the manner of gaining possession of these papers. They were lately in the hands of Watson, but Watson has disappeared. Suspicions are awake respecting the cause of his disappearance. These suspicions are connected with Welbeck, and Welbeck's connection with you is not unknown." "These are evils, but I see not how an ingenious and open conduct is adapted to increase these evils. If they come, I must endure them." "I believe your decision is right. No one is so skilful an advocate in a cause as he whose cause it is. I rely upon your skill and address, and shall leave you to pursue your own way. I must leave you for a time, but shall expect to be punctually informed of all that passes." With this agreement we parted, and I hastened to perform my intended journey. End of chapter 38. Of Arthur Mervyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Arthur Mervyn by Charles Brockden Brown. Chapter 39. I am glad, my friend, thy nimble pen has got so far upon its journey. What remains of my story may be dispatched in a trice. I have just now some vacant hours which might possibly be more usefully employed, but not in an easier manner or more pleasant. So let me carry on thy thread. First, let me mention the resolutions I had formed at the time I parted with my friend. I had several objects in view. One was a conference with Mrs. Wentworth; another was an interview with her whom I met with at Villars's. My heart melted when I thought upon the desolate condition of Clemenza, and determined me to direct my first efforts for her relief. For this end I was to visit the female who had given me a direction to her house. The name of this person is Asha Fielding, and she lived, according to her own direction, at No. 40 Walnut Street. I went thither without delay. She was not at home. Having gained information from the servant as to when she might be found, I proceeded to Mrs. Wentworth's. In going thither, my mind was deeply occupied in meditation, and, with my usual carelessness of forms, I entered the house and made my way to the parlour, where an interview had formerly taken place between us. Having arrived, I began, though somewhat unseasonably, to reflect upon the topics with which I should introduce my conversation, and particularly the manner in which I should introduce myself. I had opened doors without warning, and traversed passages without being noticed. This had arisen from my thoughtlessness. There was no one within hearing or sight. What was next to be done? Should I not return softly to the outer door, and summon the servant by knocking? Preparing to do this, I heard a footstep in the entry which suspended my design. I stood in the middle of the floor, attentive to these movements, when presently the door opened, and there entered the apartment Mrs. Wentworth herself. She came, as it seemed, without expectation of finding any one there. When, therefore, the figure of a man caught her vagrant attention, she started and cast a hasty look towards me. "Pray," in a peremptory tone, "how came you here, sir? And what is your business?" Neither arrogance on the one hand, nor humility on the other, had any part in modelling my deportment. I came not to deprecate anger or exult over distress. I answered, therefore, distinctly, firmly, and erectly. "I came to see you, madam, and converse with you; but, being busy with other thoughts, I forgot to knock at the door. No evil was intended by my negligence, though propriety has certainly not been observed. Will you pardon this intrusion, and condescend to grant me your attention?" "To what? What have you to say to me? I know you only as the accomplice of a villain in an attempt to deceive me. There is nothing to justify your coming hither, and I desire you to leave the house with as little ceremony as you entered it." My eyes were lowered at this rebuke, yet I did not obey the command. "Your treatment of me, madam, is such as I appear to you to deserve. Appearances are unfavourable to me, but those appearances are false. I have concurred in no plot against your reputation or your fortune. I have told you nothing but the truth. I came hither to promote no selfish or sinister purpose. I have no favour to entreat, and no petition to offer, but that you will suffer me to clear up those mistakes which you have harboured respecting me. I am poor. I am destitute of fame and of kindred. I have nothing to console me in obscurity and indigence, but the approbation of my own heart and the good opinion of those who know me as I am. The good may be led to despise and condemn me. Their aversion and scorn shall not make me unhappy, but it is my interest and my duty to rectify their error if I can. I regard your character with esteem. You have been mistaking and condemning me as a liar and impostor, and I came to remove this mistake. I came, if not to procure your esteem, at least to take away hatred and suspicion. But this is not all my purpose. You are in an error in relation not only to my character, but to the situation of your nephew Clavering. I formerly told you that I saw him die, that I assisted at his burial, but my tale was incoherent and imperfect, and you have since received intelligence to which you think proper to trust, and which assures you that he is still living. All I now ask is your attention, while I relate the particulars of my knowledge. Proof of my veracity or innocence may be of no value in your eyes, but the fate of your nephew ought to be known to you. Certainty on this head may be of much importance to your happiness and to the regulation of your future conduct. To hear me patiently can do you no injury, and may benefit you much. Will you permit me to go on?" During this address, little abatement of resentment and scorn was visible in my companion. "I will hear you," she replied. "Your invention may amuse, if it does not edify. But I pray you, let your story be short." I was obliged to be content with this ungraceful concession, and proceeded to begin my narration. I described the situation of my father's dwelling. I mentioned the year, month, day, and hour of her nephew's appearance among us. I expatiated minutely on his form, features, dress, sound of his voice, and repeated his words. His favourite gestures and attitudes were faithfully described. I had gone but a little way in my story, when the effects were visible in her demeanour which I expected from it. Her knowledge of the youth, and of the time and manner of his disappearance, made it impossible for me, with so minute a narrative, to impose upon her credulity. Every word, every incident related, attested my truth by their agreement with what she herself previously knew. Her suspicious and angry watchfulness was quickly exchanged for downcast looks and stealing tears, and sighs difficultly repressed. Meanwhile, I did not pause, but described the treatment he received from my mother's tenderness, his occupations, the freaks of his insanity, and, finally, the circumstances of his death and funeral. Thence I hastened to the circumstances which brought me to the city, which placed me in the service of Welbeck, and obliged me to perform so ambiguous a part in her presence. I left no difficulty to be solved, and no question unanticipated. "I have now finished my story," I continued, "and accomplished my design in coming hither. Whether I have vindicated my integrity from your suspicions, I know not. I have done what in me lay to remove your error, and in that have done my duty. What more remains? Any inquiries you are pleased to make, I am ready to answer. If there be none to make, I will comply with your former commands, and leave the house with as little ceremony as I entered it." "Your story," she replied, "has been unexpected. I believe it fully, and I am sorry for the hard thoughts which past appearances have made me entertain concerning you." Here she sunk into mournful silence. "The information," she at length resumed, "which I have received from another quarter respecting that unfortunate youth astonishes and perplexes me. It is inconsistent with your story, but it must be founded on some mistake which I am, at present, unable to unravel. Welbeck, whose connection has been so unfortunate to you—" "Unfortunate! Dear madam, how unfortunate? It has done away a part of my ignorance of the world in which I live. It has led me to the situation in which I am now placed. It has introduced me to the knowledge of many good people. It has made me the witness and the subject of many acts of beneficence and generosity. My knowledge of Welbeck has been useful to me. It has enabled me to be useful to others. I look back upon that allotment of my destiny which first led me to his door with gratitude and pleasure. Would to heaven," continued I, somewhat changing my tone, "intercourse with Welbeck had been as harmless to all others as it has been to me. That no injury to fortune and fame, and innocence and life, had been incurred by others greater than has fallen upon my head. There is one being whose connection with him has not been utterly dissimilar in its origin and circumstances to mine, though the catastrophe has, indeed, been widely and mournfully different. And yet, within this moment, a thought has occurred from which I derive some consolation and some hope. You, dear madam, are rich. These spacious apartments, this plentiful accommodation, are yours. You have enough for your own gratification and convenience, and somewhat to spare. Will you take into your protecting arms, to your hospitable roof, an unhappy girl whom the arts of Welbeck have robbed of fortune, reputation, and honour, who is now languishing in poverty, weeping over the lifeless remains of her babe, surrounded by the agents of vice, and trembling on the verge of infamy?" "What can this mean?" replied the lady. "Of whom do you speak?" "You shall know her. You shall be apprized of her claims to your compassion. Her story, as far as is known to me, I will faithfully repeat to you. She is a stranger, an Italian. Her name is Clemenza Lodi." "Clemenza Lodi! Good heaven!" exclaimed Mrs. Wentworth. "Why, surely it cannot be. And yet is it possible that you are that person?" "I do not comprehend you, madam." "A friend has related a transaction of a strange sort. It is scarcely an hour since she told it me. The name of Clemenza Lodi was mentioned in it, and a young man of a most singular deportment was described. But tell me how you were engaged on Thursday morning." "I was coming to this city from a distance. I stopped 10 minutes at the house of—" "Mrs. Villars?" "The same. Perhaps you know her and her character. Perhaps you can confirm or rectify my present opinions concerning her. It is there that the unfortunate Clemenza abides. It is thence that I wish her to be speedily removed." "I have heard of you, of your conduct upon that occasion." "Of me?" answered I, eagerly. "Do you know that woman?" So saying, I produced the card which I had received from her, and on which her name was written. "I know her well. She is my countrywoman and my friend." "Your friend? Then she is good, she is innocent, she is generous. Will she be a sister, a protectress to Clemenza? Will you exhort her to a deed of charity? Will you be yourself an example of beneficence? Direct me to Miss Fielding, I beseech you. I have called on her already, but in vain, and there is no time to be lost." "Why are you so precipitate? What would you do?" "Take her away from that house instantly, and bring her hither. Place her under your protection. Give her Mrs. Wentworth for a counsellor, a friend, a mother. Shall I do this? Shall I hie hither to-day, this very hour, now? Give me your consent, and she shall be with you before noon." "By no means," replied she, with earnestness. "You are too hasty. An affair of so much importance cannot be despatched in a moment. There are many difficulties and doubts to be first removed. Let them be reserved for the future. Withhold not your helping hand till the struggle has disappeared forever. Think on the gulf that is already gaping to swallow her. This is no time to hesitate and falter. I will tell you her story, but not now. We will postpone it till to-morrow, and first secure her from impending evils. She shall tell it to you herself. In an hour I will bring her hither, and she herself shall recount to you her sorrows. Will you let me?" "Your behaviour is extraordinary. I can scarcely tell whether this simplicity be real or affected. One would think that your common sense would show you the impropriety of your request. To admit under my roof a woman notoriously dishonoured, and from an infamous house—" "My dearest madam, how can you reflect upon the situation without irresistible pity? I see that you are thoroughly aware of her past calamity and her present danger. Do not these urge you to make haste to her relief? Can any lot be more deplorable than hers? Can any state be more perilous? Poverty is not the only evil that oppresses or threatens her. The scorn of the world and her own compunction, the death of the fruit of her error, and the witness of her shame, are not the worst. She is exposed to the temptations of the profligate while she remains with Mrs. Villars. Her infamy accumulates. Her further debasement is facilitated. Her return to reputation and to virtue is obstructed by new bars. How know I that her debasement is not already complete and irremediable? She is a mother, but not a wife. How came she thus? Is her being Welbeck's prostitute no proof of her guilt? Alas, I know not. I believe her not very culpable. I know her to be unfortunate, to have been robbed and betrayed. You are a stranger to her history. I am myself imperfectly acquainted with it, but let me tell you the little that I know. Perhaps my narrative may cause you to think of her as I do. She did not object to this proposal, and I immediately recounted all that I had gained from my own observations, or from Welbeck himself, respecting this forlorn girl. Having finished my narrative, I proceeded thus: Can you hesitate to employ that power which was given you for good ends, to rescue this sufferer? Take her to your home, to your bosom, to your confidence. Keep aloof those temptations which beset her in her present situation. Restore her to that purity which her desolate condition, her ignorance, her misplaced gratitude, and the artifices of a skilful dissembler have destroyed, if it be destroyed. For how know we under what circumstances her ruin was accomplished? With what pretences or appearances or promises she was won to compliance? True, I confess my ignorance, but ought not that ignorance to be removed before she makes part of my family? Oh, no, it may be afterwards removed. It cannot be removed before. By bringing her hither you shield her, at least, from future and possible evils. Here you can watch her conduct and sift her sentiments conveniently and at leisure. Should she prove worthy of your charity, how justly may you congratulate yourself on your seasonable efforts in her cause. If she prove unworthy, you may then demean yourself according to her demerits. I must reflect upon it. To-morrow, let me prevail on you to admit her at once and without delay. This very moment may be the critical one. To-day we may exert ourselves with success, but to-morrow all our efforts may be fruitless. Why fluctuate, why linger, when so much good may be done, and no evil can possibly be incurred? It requires but a word from you. You need not move a finger. Your house is large, you have chambers vacant and convenient. Consent only that your door shall not be barred against her, that you will treat her with civility, to carry your kindness into effect, to persuade her to attend me hither, and to place herself in your care, shall be my province. These and many similar entreaties and reasonings were ineffectual. Her general disposition was kind, but she was unaccustomed to strenuous or sudden exertions. To admit the persuasions of such an advocate to so uncommon a scheme as that of sharing her house with a creature thus previously unknown to her, thus loaded with suspicion and with obloquy, was not possible. I at last forbore importunity, and requested her to tell me when I might expect to meet with Mrs. Fielding at her lodgings. Inquiry was made to what end I sought an interview. I made no secret of my purpose. "Are you mad, young man?" she exclaimed. "Mrs. Fielding has already been egregiously imprudent. On the faith of an ancient slight acquaintance with Mrs. Villars in Europe, she suffered herself to be decoyed into a visit. Instead of taking warning by numerous tokens of the real character of that woman, in her behaviour and in that of her visitants, she consented to remain there one night. The next morning took place that astonishing interview with you, which she has since described to me. She is now warned against the like indiscretion. And pray, what benevolent scheme would you propose to her? Has she property? Is she rich? She is. Unhappily, perhaps, for her, she is absolute mistress of her fortune, and has neither guardian nor parent to control her in the use of it. Has she virtue? Does she know the value of affluence and fair fame? And will she not devote a few dollars to rescue a fellow creature from indigence and infamy and vice? Surely she will. She will hazard nothing by the boon. I will be her almoner. I will provide the wretched stranger with food and raiment and dwelling. I will pay for all if Mrs. Fielding, from her superfluity, will supply the means. Clemenza shall owe life and honour to your friend, till I am able to supply the needful sum from my own stock." While thus speaking, my companion gazed at me with steadfastness. "I know not what to make of you. Your language and ideas are those of a lunatic. Are you acquainted with Mrs. Fielding?" "Yes, I have seen her 2 days ago. She has invited me to see her again." "And on the strength of this acquaintance you expect to be her almoner? To be the medium of her charity?" "I desire to save her trouble, to make charity as light and as easy as possible. 'Twill be better if she perform those offices herself. 'Twill redound more to the credit of her reason and her virtue, but I solicit her benignity only in the cause of Clemenza. For her only do I wish at present to call forth her generosity and pity. And do you imagine she will entrust her money to one of your age and sex, whom she knows so imperfectly, to administer to the wants of one whom she found in a house such as Mrs. Villars's? She never will. She mentioned her imprudent engagement to meet you, but she is now warned against the folly of such confidence. You have told me plausible stories of yourself and of this Clemenza. I cannot say I disbelieve them, but I know the ways of the world too well to bestow implicit faith so easily. You are an extraordinary young man. You may possibly be honest. Such a one as you, with your education and address, may possibly have passed all your life in a hovel, but it is scarcely credible, let me tell you. I believe most of the facts respecting my nephew, because my knowledge of him before his flight would enable me to detect your falsehood, but there must be other proofs besides an innocent brow and a voluble tongue to make me give full credit to your pretensions. I have no claim upon Welbeck which can embarrass you. On that score you are free from any molestation from me or my friends. I have suspected you of being an accomplice in some vile plot, and am now inclined to acquit you, but that is all you must expect from me, till your character be established by other means than your own assertions. I am engaged at present, and must therefore request you to put an end to your visit." This strain was much unlike the strain which preceded it. I imagined, by the mildness of her tone and manners, that her unfavourable prepossessions were removed, but they seemed to have suddenly regained their pristine force. I was somewhat disconcerted by this unexpected change. I stood for a minute silent and irresolute. Just then a knock was heard at the door, and presently entered that very female whom I had met with at Mrs. Villars's. I caught her figure as I glanced through the window. Mrs. Wentworth darted at me many significant glances, which commanded me to withdraw, but, with this object in view, it was impossible. As soon as she entered, her eyes were fixed upon me. Certain recollections naturally occurred at that moment, and made her cheeks glow. Some confusion reigned for a moment, but that was quickly dissipated. She did not notice me, but exchanged salutations with her friend. All this while I stood near the window, in a situation not a little painful. Certain tremors which I had not been accustomed to feel, and which seemed to possess a mystical relation to the visitant, disabled me at once from taking my leave, or from performing any useful purpose by staying. At length, struggling for composure, I approached her, and, showing her the card she had given me, said, "Agreeably to this direction, I called an hour ago at your lodgings. I found you not. I hope you will permit me to call once more. When shall I expect to meet you at home?" Her eyes were cast on the floor. A kind of indirect attention was fixed on Mrs. Wentworth, serving to intimidate and check her. At length she said, in an irresolute voice, "I shall be home this evening." "And this evening," replied I will call to see you." So saying, I left the house. This interval was tedious, but was to be endured with equanimity. I was impatient to be gone to Baltimore, and hoped to be able to set out by dawn of the next day. Meanwhile, I was necessarily to perform something with respect to Clemenza. After dinner I accompanied Mrs. Stevens to visit Miss Carlton. I was eager to see a woman who could bear adversity in the manner which my friend had described. She met us at the door of her apartment. Her seriousness was not abated by her smiles of affability and welcome. "My friend," whispered I, "how truly lovely is this Miss Carlton! Are the heart and the intelligence within worthy of these features?" "Yes, they are. The accounts of her employments, of her resignation to the ill fate of the brother whom she loves, proves that they are." My eyes were riveted to her countenance and person. I felt uncontrollable eagerness to speak to her and to gain her good opinion. "You must know this young man, my dear Miss Carlton," said my friend, looking at me. "He is my husband's friend, and professes a great desire to be yours. You must not treat him as a mere stranger, for he knows your character and situation already, as well as that of your brother." She looked at me with benignity. "I accept his friendship willingly and gratefully, and shall endeavour to convince him that his good opinion is not misplaced." There now ensued a conversation somewhat general, in which this young woman showed a mind vigorous from exercise and unembarrassed by care. She affected no concealment of her own condition, of her wants, or her comforts. She laid no stress upon misfortunes, but contrived to deduce some beneficial consequence to herself, and some motive for gratitude to Heaven, from every wayward incident that had befallen her. This demeanour emboldened me, at length, to inquire into the cause of her brother's imprisonment and the nature of his debt. She answered frankly and without hesitation. "It is a debt of his father's, for which he made himself responsible during his father's life. The act was generous but imprudent, as the event has shown, though, at the time, the unhappy effects could not be foreseen. My father," continued she, "was arrested by his creditor at a time when the calmness and comforts of his own dwelling were necessary to his health. The creditor was obdurate, and would release him upon no condition but that of receiving a bond from my brother, by which he engaged to pay the debt at several successive times and in small portions. All these instalments were discharged with great difficulty indeed, but with sufficient punctuality, except the last, to which my brother's earnings were not adequate." "How much is the debt?" $400. "And is the state of the creditor such as to make the loss of $400 of more importance to him than the loss of liberty to your brother?" She answered, smiling, "That is a very abstract view of things. On such a question you and I might, perhaps, easily decide in favour of my brother, but would there not be some danger of deciding partially? His conduct is a proof of his decision, and there's no power to change it." "Will not argument change it? Methinks in so plain a case I should be able to convince him. You say he is rich and childless. His annual income is 10 times more than this sum. Your brother cannot pay the debt while in prison, whereas, if at liberty, he might slowly and finally discharge it. If his humanity would not yield, his avarice might be brought to acquiesce. But there is another passion which you would find it somewhat harder to subdue, and that is his vengeance. He thinks himself wronged, and imprisons my brother, not to enforce payment, but to inflict misery. If you could persuade him that there is no hardship in imprisonment, you would speedily gain the victory, but that could not be attempted consistently with truth. In proportion to my brother's suffering is his gratification." "You draw an odious and almost incredible portrait." "And yet such a one would serve for the likeness of almost every second man we meet." "And is such your opinion of mankind? Your experience must surely have been of a rueful tenor to justify such hard thoughts of the rest of your species." By no means. It has been what those whose situation disables them from looking further than the surface of things would regard as unfortunate; but, if my goods and evils were equitably balanced, the former would be the weightiest. I have found kindness and goodness in great numbers, but have likewise met prejudice and rancour in many. My opinion of Farquhar is not lightly taken up. I saw him yesterday, and the true nature of his motives in the treatment of my brother was plain enough." Here the topic was succeeded by others, and the conversation ceased not till the hour had arrived on which I had preconcerted to visit Mrs. Fielding. I left my two friends for this purpose. I was admitted to Mrs. Fielding's presence without scruple or difficulty. There were two females in her company, and one of the other sex, well-dressed, elderly, and sedate persons. Their discourse turned upon political topics, with which, as you know, I have but slight acquaintance. They talked of fleets and armies, of Robespierre and Pitt, of whom I had only a newspaper knowledge. In a short time the women rose, and, huddling on their cloaks, disappeared in company with the gentlemen. Being thus left alone with Mrs. Fielding, some embarrassment was mutually betrayed. With much hesitation, which, however, gradually disappeared, my companion at length began the conversation. "You met me lately in a situation, sir, on which I look back with trembling and shame, but not with any self-condemnation. I was led into it without any fault, unless a too hasty confidence may be styled a fault. I had known Mrs. Villars in England, where she lived with an untainted reputation, at least, and the sight of my countrywoman in a foreign land awakened emotions in the indulgence of which I did not imagine there was either any guilt or any danger. She invited me to see her at her house with so much urgency and warmth, and solicited me to take a place immediately in a chaise in which she had come to the city, that I too incautiously complied. You are a stranger to me, and I am unacquainted with your character. What little I have seen of your deportment, and what little I have lately heard concerning you from Mrs. Wentworth, do not produce unfavourable impressions; but the apology I have made was due to my own reputation, and should have been offered to you whatever your character had been." There she stopped. "I came not hither," said I, "to receive an apology. Your demeanour on our first interview shielded you sufficiently from any suspicions or surmises that I could form. What you have now mentioned was likewise mentioned by your friend, and was fully believed upon her authority. My purpose in coming related not to you but to another. I desired merely to interest your generosity and justice on behalf of one whose destitute and dangerous condition may lay claim to your compassion and your succour." "I comprehend you," said she, with an air of some perplexity. "I know the claims of that person." "And will you comply with them?" "In what manner can I serve her?" "By giving her the means of living." "Does she not possess them already?" "She is destitute. Her dependence was wholly placed upon one that is dead, by whom her person was dishonoured and her fortune embezzled." "But she still lives. She is not turned into the street. She is not destitute of home." "But what a home!" "Such as she may choose to remain in." "She cannot choose it. She must not choose it. She remains through ignorance, or through the incapacity of leaving it." "But how shall she be persuaded to a change?" "I will persuade her. I will fully explain her situation. I will supply her with a new home." "You will persuade her to go with you, and to live at a home of your providing and on your bounty?" "Certainly." "Would that change be worthy of a cautious person? Would it benefit her reputation? Would it prove her love of independence?" "My purposes are good. I know not why she should suspect them, but I am only anxious to be the instrument. Let her be indebted to one of her own sex, of unquestionable reputation. Admit her into this house. Invite her to your arms. Cherish and console her as your sister. Before I am convinced that she deserves it, and even then, what regard shall I, young, unmarried, independent, affluent, pay to my own reputation in harbouring a woman in these circumstances? But you need not act yourself. Make me your agent and almoner. Only supply her with the means of subsistence through me. Would you have me act a clandestine part, hold meetings with one of your sex, and give him money for a purpose which I must hide from the world? Is it worth while to be a dissembler and impostor? And will not such conduct incur more dangerous surmises and suspicions than would arise from acting openly and directly? You will forgive me for reminding you, likewise, that it is particularly incumbent upon those in my situation to be circumspect in their intercourse with men and with strangers. This is the second time that I have seen you. My knowledge of you is extremely dubious and imperfect, and such as would make the conduct you prescribe to me in a high degree rash and culpable. You must not, therefore, expect me to pursue it. These words were delivered with an air of firmness and dignity. I was not insensible to the truth of her representations. I confess, said I, what you have said makes me doubt the propriety of my proposal, yet I would fain be of service to her. Can you not point out some practicable method? She was silent and thoughtful, and seemed indisposed to answer my question. I had set my heart upon success in this negotiation, continued I, and could not imagine any obstacle to its success. But I find my ignorance of the world's ways much greater than I had previously expected. You defraud yourself of all the happiness redounding from the act of making others happy. You sacrifice substance to show, and are more anxious to prevent unjust aspersions from lighting on yourself than to rescue a fellow creature from guilt and infamy. You are rich, and abound in all the conveniences and luxuries of life. A small portion of your superfluity would obviate the wants of a being not less worthy than yourself. It is not avarice or aversion to labour that makes you withhold your hand. It is dread of the sneers and surmises of malevolence and ignorance. I will not urge you further at present. Your determination to be wise should not be hasty. Think upon the subject calmly and sedately, and form your resolution in the course of 3 days. At the end of that period I will visit you again. So saying, and without waiting for comment or answer, I withdrew. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of Arthur Mervyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Arthur Mervyn by Charles Brockden Brown. Chapter 40. I mounted the stagecoach at daybreak the next day, in company with a sallow Frenchman from Santo Domingo, his fiddle-case, an ape, and 2 female blacks. The Frenchman, after passing the suburbs, took out his violin and amused himself with humming to his own tweedle tweedle. The monkey now and then munched an apple, which was given to him from a basket by the blacks, who gazed with stupid wonder and an exclamatory "la la" upon the passing scenery, or chattered to each other in a sort of open-mouthed, half-articulate, monotonous sing-song jargon. The man looked seldom either on this side or that, and spoke only to rebuke the frolics of the monkey with a "Tenez, Dominique, prenez garde, diable noir." As to me, my thought was busy in 1,000 ways. I sometimes gazed at the faces of my 4 companions, and endeavoured to discern the differences and samenesses between them. I took an exact account of the features, proportions, looks, and gestures of the monkey, the Congolese, and the Creole Gaul. I compared them together, and examined them apart. I looked at them in 1,000 different points of view, and pursued, untired and unsatiated, those trains of reflections which began at each change of tone, feature, and attitude. I marked the country as it successively arose before me, and found endless employment in examining the shape and substance of the fence, the barn, and the cottage, the aspect of the earth and of heaven. How great are the pleasures of health and of mental activity! My chief occupation, however, related to the scenes into which I was about to enter. My imaginations were, of course, crude and inadequate, and I found an uncommon gratification in comparing realities, as they successively occurred, with the pictures which my wayward fancy had depicted. I will not describe my dreams. My proper task is to relate the truth. Neither shall I dwell upon the images suggested by the condition of the country through which I passed. I will confine myself to mentioning the transactions connected with the purpose of my journey. I reached Baltimore at night. I was not so fatigued but that I could ramble through the town. I intended at present merely the gratification of a stranger's curiosity. My visit to Mrs. Watson and her brother I designed should take place on the morrow. The evening of my arrival I deemed an unseasonable time. While roving about, however, it occurred to me that it might not be impolitic to find the way to their habitation even now. My purposes of general curiosity would equally be served whichever way my steps were bent, and to trace the path to their dwelling would save me the trouble of inquiries and interrogations to-morrow. When I looked forward to an interview with the wife of Watson, and to the subject which would necessarily be discussed at that interview, I felt a trembling and misgiving at my heart. Surely, thought I, it will become me to exercise immeasurable circumspection and address, and yet how little are these adapted to the impetuosity and candour of my nature! How am I to introduce myself? What am I to tell her? That I was a sort of witness to the murder of her husband? That I received from the hand of his assassin the letter which I afterwards transmitted to her, and from the same hands the bills contained in his girdle? How will she start and look aghast? What suspicions will she harbour? What inquiries shall be made of me? How shall they be disarmed and eluded or answered? Deep consideration will be necessary before I trust myself to such an interview. The coming night shall be devoted to reflection upon this subject. From these thoughts I proceeded to inquiries for the street mentioned in the advertisement where Mrs. Watson was said to reside. The street and, at length, the habitation was found. Having reached a station opposite, I paused and surveyed the mansion. It was a wooden edifice of 2 stories, humble but neat. You ascended to the door by several stone steps. Of the 2 lower windows, the shutters of one were closed, but those of the other were open. Though late in the evening, there was no appearance of light or fire within. Beside the house was a painted fence, through which was a gate leading to the back of the building. Guided by the impulse of the moment, I crossed the street to the gate, and, lifting the latch, entered the paved alley, on one side of which was a paled fence, and on the other the house, looking through 2 windows into the alley. The first window was dark, like those in the front, but at the second a light was discernible. I approached it, and, looking through, beheld a plain but neat apartment, in which parlour, kitchen, and nursery seemed to be united. A fire burned cheerfully in the chimney, over which was a tea-kettle. On the hearth sat a smiling and playful cherub of a boy, tossing something to a black girl who sat opposite, and whose innocent and regular features wanted only a different hue to make them beautiful. Near it, in a rocking-chair with a sleeping babe in her lap, sat a female figure in plain but neat and becoming attire. Her posture permitted half her face to be seen, and saved me from any danger of being observed. This countenance was full of sweetness and benignity, but the sadness that veiled its lustre was profound. Her eyes were now fixed upon the fire, and were moist with the tears of remembrance, while she sung, in low and scarcely audible strains, an artless lullaby. This spectacle exercised a strange power over my feelings. While occupied in meditating on the features of the mother, I was unaware of my conspicuous situation. The black girl, having occasion to change her situation in order to reach the ball which was thrown at her, unluckily caught a glance of my figure through the glass. In a tone of half surprise and half terror, she cried out, "Oh, see there, a man!" I was tempted to draw suddenly back, but on second thought showed me the impropriety of departing thus abruptly and leaving behind me some alarm. I felt a sort of necessity for apologizing for my intrusion into these precincts, and hastened to a door that led into the same apartment. I knocked. A voice, somewhat confused, bade me enter. It was not till I opened the door and entered the room that I fully saw in what embarrassments I had incautiously involved myself. I could scarcely obtain sufficient courage to speak, and gave a confused assent to the question, "Have you business with me, sir?" She offered me a chair, and I sat down. She put the child, not yet awakened, into the arms of the black, who kissed it and rocked it in her arms with great satisfaction, and, resuming her seat, looked at me with inquisitiveness mingled with complacency. After a moment's pause, I said, "I was directed to this house as the abode of Mr. Ephraim Williams. Can he be seen, madam?" "He is not in town at present. If you will leave a message with me, I will punctually deliver it." The thought suddenly occurred whether any more was needful than merely to leave the bills suitably enclosed, as they already were, in a packet. Thus, all painful explanations might be avoided, and I might have reason to congratulate myself on his seasonable absence. Actuated by these thoughts, I drew forth the packet and put it into her hand, saying, "I will leave this in your possession, and must earnestly request you to keep it safe until you can deliver it into his own hands." Scarcely had I said this before new suggestions occurred. Was it right to act in this clandestine and mysterious manner? Should I leave these persons in uncertainty respecting the fate of a husband and a brother? What perplexities, misunderstandings, and suspenses might not grow out of this uncertainty? And ought they not to be precluded at any hazard to my own safety or good name? These sentiments made me involuntarily stretch forth my hand to retake the packet. This gesture, and other significances in my manners, joined to a trembling consciousness in herself, filled my companion with all the tokens of confusion and fear. She alternately looked at me and at the paper. Her trepidation increased, and she grew pale. These emotions were counteracted by a strong effort. At length she said, falteringly, "I will take good care of them, and will give them to my brother." She rose and placed them in a drawer, after which she resumed her seat. On this occasion all my wariness forsook me. I cannot explain why my perplexity and the trouble of my thoughts were greater upon this than upon similar occasions. However it be, I was incapable of speaking, and fixed my eyes upon the floor. A sort of electrical sympathy pervaded my companion, and terror and anguish were strongly manifested in the glances which she sometimes stole at me. We seemed fully to understand each other without the aid of words. This imbecility could not last long. I gradually recovered my composure and collected my scattered thoughts. I looked at her with seriousness and steadfastly spoke. "Are you the wife of Amos Watson?" She started. "I am indeed. Why do you ask? Do you know anything of—" There her voice failed. I replied with quickness, "Yes, I am fully acquainted with his destiny." "Good God!" she exclaimed, in a paroxysm of surprise, and bending eagerly forward. "My husband is then alive! This packet is from him. Where is he? When have you seen him?" "'Tis a long time since." "But where is he now? Is he well? Will he return to me?" "Never." "Merciful Heaven!" Looking upwards and clasping her hands, "I thank thee at least for his life. But why has he forsaken me? Why will he not return?" "For a good reason," said I, with augmented solemnity. "He will never return to thee. Long ago was he laid in the cold grave." She shrieked, and at the next moment sunk in a swoon upon the floor. I was alarmed. The 2 children shrieked, and ran about the room terrified and unknowing what they did. I was overwhelmed with somewhat like terror, yet I involuntarily raised the mother in my arms, and cast about for the means of recalling her from this fit. Time to effect this had not elapsed, when several persons, apparently Mrs. Watson's neighbours, and raised by the outcries of the girls, hastily entered the room. They looked at me with mingled surprise and suspicion, but my attitude being not that of an injurer but helper, my countenance, which showed the pleasure at their entrance, at this critical moment, afforded me and my words, in which I besought their assistance, and explained in some degree and briefly the cause of those appearances, removed their ill thoughts. Presently the unhappy woman, being carried by the new comers into a bedroom adjoining, recovered her sensibility. I only waited for this. I had done my part. More information would be useless to her, and not to be given by me, at least in the present audience, without embarrassment and peril. I suddenly determined to withdraw, and this, the attention of the company being otherwise engaged, I did without notice. I returned to my inn, and shut myself up in my chamber. Such was the change which, undesigned, unforeseen, half an hour had wrought in my situation. My cautious projects had perished in their conception. That which I had deemed so arduous, to require such circumspect approaches, such well-concerted speeches, was done. I had started up before this woman as if from the pores of the ground. I had vanished with the same celerity, but had left her in possession of proofs sufficient that I was neither spectre nor demon. "I will visit her," said I, "again. I will see her brother, and know the full effect of my disclosure. I will tell them all that I myself know. Ignorance would be no less injurious to them than to myself, but first I will see the Maurices." Chapter 40.